Good afternoon, and welcome to the Distinguished Lecture in Global Security Law and Policy. I am Robert Strassfeld, the Director of the Institute for Global Security Law and Policy here at the law school at Case Western. The Institute is part of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center and serves as a locus of research and teaching relating to counterterrorism, peace, and security in a world that regrettably is insecure and conflict-ridden. I'm going to very quickly advertise a few upcoming events, so please indulge me. On Monday, March 24th, same time here, Captain Keith Petty, who is a prosecutor in the Office of Military Commissions and a graduate of this law school, will speak on prosecuting terror in an age of cynicism, military commissions, Guantanamo Bay, and the law. Then on April 11th, Friday, April 11th, there will be a full-day symposium. It is part of a three-day program sponsored by us and the International Congress of Penal Law. The symposium will be the World Conference on Combating Terrorism Financing. And then on Monday, April 14th, Jamil Jaffer, who is the director of the National Security Project of the ACLU, will be here to speak on litigating detainee cases in a talk entitled Torture, A History of the Present. 5 years ago tomorrow, at the outset of the Iraq War, the United States began a campaign called Shock and Awe, which was an effort to use massive air power and missile strikes to dispirit and overwhelm the enemy. So it is quite timely to consider the meaning and legal implications of the use of such air power here today. And we could not have a better person to do that than Elizabeth Hillman. Elizabeth Hillman is a graduate of Duke University. She then did military service in the Air Force and was an instructor at the Air Force Academy before earning her JD and PhD in history at Yale University. Since then, she has taught at Rutgers University School of Law at Camden and now at California Hastings Law School. She is the co-author of the casebook Military Justice, Cases and Materials, and the author of Defending America, Military Culture and the Cold War Court-Martial, a terrific history of courts-martial in the post-World War II era that puts at the center issues of gender and sexuality. She has also written recently on women and the military in a number of contexts, including a book chapter, Guarding Women, Abu Ghraib, and the Military Sexual Culture. She's here today, however, to speak about the bomber generals and the new laws of war, terror, romance, and American air power.
First, I want to thank the law school and the Institute for Global Security and Law and Policy for bringing me here, for Bob for inviting me. I appreciate the invitation very much. It's always a pleasure to bring out new work, and it's especially nice when you have an excellent host as Case Western has been. I appreciate, too, Nancy Pratt and Alice Simon for taking good care of me. I also appreciate the weather. It was a beautiful day today, and the snow was done by the time my plane landed, and I got to see snow on the tree. And since I've moved to the Bay Area, I don't get to see snow on a regular basis, so I'm grateful for that, too. So let me start by saying I think that the title that I gave this is a little too grand, the bomber generals and the new laws of war. However, I will try to give you, if not a thorough understanding of all these things that are so complicated and that I'm working hard to try to sort out right now. If not a thorough understanding, at least some insight into their past and present. Let me explain to you first, excuse me, how I came to this topic. Last year, I picked up a new biography of General Curtis LeMay. It's in the Great Generals series published by Palgrave. It's a popular book out there right now. It has a preface by General Wesley Clark. And a particular passage in that preface struck me. It's a passage that General Clark wrote in discussing LeMay's role in the firebombing of Japanese cities. What he wrote was, Clark writing about LeMay, in retrospect, many have expressed reservations about firebombing cities. Such acts today are outlawed. And that got me to thinking. Today, after the fact, people expressed reservations since that time. No one expressed reservations at the time. And second, today such acts are outlawed. Is that right? Or is firebombing of cities actually outlawed today? Today I'll try to answer those questions, or at least start. I think we have to look back at least as far as World War II to start to understand how such a terrifying concept, that is the massive deaths of civilians at the hands of sophisticated military weapon systems, became such a part of the American way of war. I seek to try to understand how bombing rocketed to the top of strategies employed by the United States military, despite the challenges that it poses to the laws of war themselves, and despite much evidence of its relative ineffectiveness. Today I'll look at three things. First, how that happened, and that's where we get the bomber generals, and also the romance part of this. Second, how the laws have made it, at the time and since, made it a violation of the laws of war to engage in much of the kind of bombing that the United States and other nations have engaged in. And third, how I think strategic bombing has been ineffective for the most part in the past, and how that ineffectiveness, apart from the moral and legal dimensions, is an argument against its use. Let me start with the definition, though, before I plunge in. I use this term strategic bombing. I ought to give you some sense of what I mean here. This is a definition of a military historian of the term strategic bombing. He writes, strategic bombing is best defined as the use of air power to strike at the very foundation of an enemy's war effort, the production of war material, the economy as a whole, or the morale of a civilian population, rather than as a direct attack upon the enemy's army or navy. Okay, so that's the sense. Strategic bombing is not a direct assault on military forces, but instead an assault on the collateral aspects of national power that make military operations possible. There are some more pejorative terms that are used to describe some of the things that I'm going to talk about. I'll stick mostly to strategic to describe this sort of bombing. But these other words give you a sense of the enmity with which this strategy has been viewed. Area bombing, carpet bombing, indiscriminate bombing, saturation bombing, or terror bombing. All of those are words that have been used to describe the sometimes intentional, sometimes collateral damage consequence, that is civilian deaths in pursuit of a different target that has been part of strategic bombing. Okay, the first section here, this is where you get romance and the bomber generals. I want to talk about the rise of bombing and how this came to be a central part of the American way of war. Air power is both the military capability and an idea. Aerial bombing, the ability to drop bombs from the air rather than direct engagement of ground forces, was a profound revolution. It was the realization of many military leaders' aspirations for control of the air. It inspired great awe and a sense of foreboding among military leaders who were aware of the dramatic consequences that could come from the ability to bomb from the air. Michael Sherry, probably our most important historian of American air power, has written, quote, that the bomber was the product of extravagant desires, that aviators themselves were celebrated as exemplars of an old pioneer spirit, as paragons of a modern scientific age, and also as populist rebels. And what Sherry means they were rebelling against was a vision of industrialized killing and warfare that was a part of World War I. Air power was seen as a corrective to the ugly, dirty trench warfare of World War I, as a less grim alternative. Flyers returned romance to the concept of war, and air power gave the United States and other parts of the world dashing, charismatic leaders who championed the development of airplanes and air power. Among those charismatic leaders are the bomber generals of my title. They're the core of military leaders, Air Force leaders during World War II, under whose watch strategic bombing came of age. They include American hero Jimmy Doolittle, who was, interestingly, a Rhodes Scholar, had a PhD in aeronautical engineering from MIT, and after the war was an executive at Shell, along with holding many government positions. He won the Medal of Honor, Doolittle did, for leading the first raid against a Japanese city against Tokyo in 1942. The bomber generals also include Carl Toohey Spatz, who was chief of the Strategic Air Forces, Ira Eaker, who was commander of the 8th Air Force, both of whom sought unsuccessfully to restrain indiscriminate bombing and argued against the use of bombing in large-scale waves against civilian targets. They also include the two generals who were the most effective advocates of bombing of civilian targets during World War II. The first is Hap Arnold, Henry Harley Arnold, nicknamed Hap for his perpetual smile, who was a cheerful but ruthless and skilled administrator, whose control over the air forces was tight. However, his grip was loosened somewhat during the war by his cardiac problems. He actually had 5 heart attacks during the course of World War II. They also include the person I'm going to talk to you the most about that I already mentioned, and that's Curtis Emerson LeMay. LeMay was, here's the Ohio angle to the story. LeMay was born in Columbus and was married in Cleveland, educated at Ohio State, where he worked in the steel mills actually to pay his way through school. LeMay is the best example of the bomber generals, the dean of the bomber generals, the most reviled, the most respected, the most important of the persons in this period in the Air Force. LeMay was a self-made man. He grew up poor. He was driven. He was perceptive. He was very tough. He was brilliant. And he was likable. Let me give you a story to demonstrate some of those things. LeMay kept a cigar in his mouth just about all the time, sometimes lit and sometimes not. There are different stories about why this was true. LeMay was, if you haven't seen him, he was built like a fullback. His demeanor fit. He had a gruff demeanor, and that fit his appearance. He liked to keep a cigar in his mouth, perhaps because he had contracted a virus in Panama that was painful and that the tobacco helped relieve the symptoms. That was one theory of why he kept the cigar all the time. The other is that he had contracted, and he did have this, Bell's palsy after a high-altitude flight, and that gave him a permanent scowl and a grimace, and so he put the cigar in his mouth to disguise that. But in any case, he pretty much always had a cigar. So one time he was on the flight line, and he had a lit cigar in his mouth, and he approached a B-52 that was fully loaded. As he approached the B-52 with the lit cigar, security policeman there, a brave, bold, young soul, said, "General, you'd better put that cigar out. The plane might explode." And LeMay responded, "It wouldn't dare." LeMay was called the greatest air commander of World War II. He developed formations that defended the planes within them better than any other formations had. He led from the front on terrifying, nightmarish missions. He also improved accuracy dramatically, sometimes at the cost of his aviators, but he cared deeply about the men who flew for him. He was promoted to 4 stars in 1951, the youngest 4-star general since Ulysses S. Grant. LeMay, and the reason I'm talking about him here today, also initiated and commanded the massive bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in Germany and in Japan. Let me just remind you of the toll and the scope of some of those raids. The first is Dresden. Dresden, a cultural capital of Europe. At the time it was bombed, it was crowded with refugees. Also, many POWs were there. At least 35,000 were killed in the bombing of Dresden. Later estimates go up to as high as 130,000, which signifies the difficulty of pinning down the exact numbers here. A story that helps you understand the devastation of Dresden that happened as a result of the raids is Kurt Vonnegut's. Vonnegut was a prisoner of war, an American prisoner of war at the time, who was being held in Dresden. When the raid started, he was shepherded with his other prisoners into an underground meat locker that was filled with cadavers. So he spent the raids cool and safe, surrounded by dead bodies. And afterwards, when they came out, he said, "We came out and the city was gone." the devastation of Dresden was complete. One of the things left standing was the only specifically military target in the city, which was a bridge that could have been used for resupply. The bridge was still there, but not much else. Tokyo is another example, and that's the example that General Clark referred to in his preface to the biography of LeMay. In Tokyo, some 300 bombers converged loaded with incendiaries. LeMay had reconfigured the capacity of the bombers so that they would carry only incendiaries to maximize their capacity. He didn't lose one plane in that raid, which was much different. LeMay's flyers lost many planes, flew very many dangerous missions. The B-17s that they flew in had open cockpits when they flew at even reasonable altitudes. It got very cold. They were open because of the machine guns that's what they used for protection. The machine guns had to be able to fire out, and thus they were open. He lost more flyers to frostbite than he did to enemy flak, and he lost a lot to enemy flak. It was sometimes 30 and 40 degrees below zero in those cockpits. But in the Tokyo raid, LeMay didn't lose anybody, lost no planes. They dropped 1,665 tons of fuel-air explosives on the city. They killed 80 to 100,000 persons, set rivers aflame, made a huge mark, and that was the start of additional fire raids against Japan that eventually burned out 100 square miles of urban Japanese land. In Tokyo itself, just that one midnight raid burned out 16 square miles of the city. Another example, in Hamburg, the flames were a mile high after the raid. The estimates are that perhaps 300,000 Germans, this is the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey right after the war, estimated 300,000 Germans died in the war. Later estimates have just about doubled that on how many Germans were closer to about 600,000 German civilians died in the war. Died in the bombing raids specifically, that is, not in combat, but in the raids, these sort of strategic bombing raids. The other example that we have to put on the end of this, although it's more than an exclamation point, is the atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which also occurred under LeMay's command. Eventually, 900,000 Japanese were killed in strategic bombing attacks, 900,000 civilians killed in that, which is 100,000 more than the soldiers who were killed in combat in the Japanese forces during the war. Now remember, the persons who are killed in these raids are not combatants for the most part. Women and children and persons and men who are too old. There are some studies that have tried to parse this and say exactly who died in these raids. For instance, in Hamburg, there's a sort of typical split. Actually, this is a little bit less disproportionate than many of them. About 160 women were killed for every 100 men in one study. So it gives you a sense of there certainly are some men who are killed in these raids, but the primary effect is to kill persons who are not in the traditional definition of combatants. Okay, so I've already moved from romance to terror, and yet we haven't gotten to the law. So let me get to that. So that's a sketch of the World War II bombing that inaugurated strategic bombing to American strategy. But where is the law? Was Clark right when he said that the generals who authorized these raids didn't think about the fact that they might be illegal or wrong? And also, was he correct that the law itself hadn't really recognized those raids as illegal at the time? Clark said, too, that he knows that they would be illegal today, and that's because General Clark, like all American generals today, is well-versed in the law of armed conflict. He's been trained on that. He understands what it means, and he knows what the principles are that govern what American military forces can do today. Let me sketch what those rules are so we understand this. I'll start with the declaration from St. Petersburg, which was from 1868, which is an important articulation of what the legitimate objects of war are. This is to give you a sense that, as you would guess, the generals who authorized these raids did think about the morality of their actions, and some were very concerned. Some felt that the good outweighed the cost of the actions, but others were not so sure. So to the law. The law of armed conflict, as General Clark has learned it, was initially the law of war. This is a part of a shift that has happened in the 20th century and into the 21st century with a convergence of military and humanitarian law. But let's start with the early version. From St. Petersburg, this is an 1868 declaration. This defines legitimate targets as the only legitimate object which states should endeavor to accomplish during war is to weaken the military forces of the enemy. that for this purpose it is sufficient to disable the greatest possible number of men. Okay, a very narrow definition of acceptable targets, combatants, and military forces particularly. Now, I think a broader sketch, for those of you who aren't already familiar with it, of the principles of the law of war helps us understand where strategic bombing fits in. There are four primary principles of the law of war: necessity, or military necessity, humanity, distinction, and proportionality. Let me just briefly define each of those. First, necessity. This is the principle that the only force that's authorized is the force that's necessary to achieve the ends, and force that is within the bounds of lawful action. Both of those pieces are an important part of necessity. Necessity does not authorize unlawful actions, but it authorizes only the force that's necessary to achieve a military victory. Francis Lieber, an important American lawyer and author of General Order 100, issued during the Civil War, a critical articulation of the laws of war. This is how he put it in his code in 1863. That what was acceptable were measures indispensable for securing the ends of the war and which are lawful. So the only available actions to a military leader were those indispensable for securing the ends of the war and which are lawful. Okay, there's some tension there. We can see that, but that's what the principle of military necessity is. Second, humanity. This is a pretty straightforward one. That is, there may not be any unnecessary infliction of suffering. Okay, no unnecessary suffering. This is from the 1907 Hague Convention, for instance, articulates this. Now, the next two principles are a part of the early law of war, but they're not, and the common law of war, but they're not articulated clearly until after LeMay's raids and after World War II and actually after Vietnam, and that's in 1977. Now, they're a part of the law of war before that, but I think we have clear articulation of them in protocols to the Hague Conventions. Okay, 1977 protocols are the best source, I think, for these particular rules. Distinction. Distinction is a principle that you must distinguish between civilian and military. You must distinguish between legitimate targets and protected civilian targets. And in fact, those off-limits targets must not only not be attacked, they must in fact be protected. The fourth is proportionality. Now, proportionality is the trickiest, perhaps. It tries to reconcile the parts of military necessity that you can feel are in conflict and to reconcile necessity with humanity. Proportionality holds that no military action can be undertaken if the projected losses that will be inflicted as a result are not proportionate to the gains that are expected, to the advantage that the proponent of that action expects from the completion of it. Okay, so it's about the balancing between the losses to be inflicted by an action and the gain that is to be made. Proportionality is not a static concept. Let me give you a sense of how this can change over time with the most dramatic example of strategic bombing, the only use of atomic weaponry in warfare with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Before the bombs were dropped in 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff did a study to try to estimate what the American losses would be if an invasion of the Japanese islands was undertaken. The JCS estimated the losses at 40,000 American men. Said 40,000 American soldiers would die were the islands to be taken. Later that year, when Truman was explaining his decision to drop the bomb, that number became 250,000. He said 250,000 Americans would have died if we had not dropped the bomb because we would have had to invade the islands, 250,000. A few years later, when Truman wrote his memoirs, it was up to 500,000. 500,000 Americans would have died. When Churchill wrote about this in 1953, he estimated 1.5 million lives were saved by the decision to drop the bomb because of the cost of the invasion. And finally, President Bush recently talked about this, and he said that millions of American lives were saved because we didn't have to invade the Japanese islands. Proportionality is a tricky concept. I'm not saying that the JCS were correct in their estimate. It's a slippery thing to define, to project casualties during war, but proportionality gets rewritten by history as well. Okay, there are some other rules that are a part of the modern law of armed conflict that are some of the reason that General Clark said that this sort of bombing would not be legal today. Let me just mention a few of those rules. First, Clark is from the Army, and some of the Army rules apply to the Air Force as well. For instance, Hague Protocol, the additional protocol that I mentioned before from 1977, in describing how to distinguish between civilian and military persons, states clearly that, quote, attacks shall be limited to strictly military objectives, okay, in land warfare as well as air warfare. The rules of air bombardment go a little bit further. I'll just give you a sense of those. First, they say bombing from the air may only be against military targets, not against civilian, that the civilian population must be protected, as well as their means of survival. That is, that population's ability to survive after the bombing must be considered before legitimate targets are identified. Therefore, indiscriminate attacks are prohibited. Cultural objects are protected. The environment is protected. And effective advance warning is required if a civilian population is to be at risk. Okay, those are all part of the rules of targeting that govern the standard training that Air Force officers and bombardiers would get. There's an additional rule that comes from, there are many other rules, but one I want to mention particularly that comes from the Conventional Weapons Convention, and that is that there are to be no incendiaries, that the fuel, air explosives, and firebombing is no longer legal. And no doubt General Clark was aware of that when he said that firebombing a city would would no longer be legal. One of the problems with bombing and these laws of war is the imprecision of bombing itself. I want to give you a sense of how imprecise bombing was before and up through World War II, so you have a sense of what these bomber generals were dealing with. Before World War II, bombing was so imprecise that any bombing really would have to be deemed indiscriminate. In 1899, when the first Hague Conference took place, a U.S. officer who was there, that's a little early for the Air Force, we weren't around yet. In 1899, a U.S. officer suggested that there should be a 5-year moratorium on all bombing from the air, and that's because at the time it was balloons that were used to drop bombs, and they were terribly inaccurate, and it couldn't help but be indiscriminate. And the American also proposed that 5-year moratorium rather than a permanent ban because he recognized that technology was likely to change and that precision would be more available later, and therefore he didn't think it should be a permanent ban. The Hague Convention did adopt that. World War I, there were many aerial raids, none of which were precise or especially effective. I think I need to give you some examples so you know how ineffective they were. When the French aimed at an aircraft factory, they hit the center of Freiburg. When the Germans aimed at a London dock, they demolished a school down the street. Even by the beginning of World War II, when the RAF did a study of how well its bombers were able to hit targets, they found that 1 in 3 managed to drop a bomb within 5 miles of its target. 1 in 3 within 5 miles of its target. Okay? American technology did help this during World War II, particularly the Norden bomb sight, which General LeMay mastered and helped to teach to the men who were flying with him. But it had limits as well. There are many natural impediments to bombing effectively from the air, and they could not be overcome quickly. The Dresden raid that I mentioned, of the planes that were headed for Dresden, most of the bombers hit their targets there, but 40 hit Prague instead. Okay, so I've talked about some of the law and some of the imprecision and challenges of technology that faced the bomber generals during the war, but how did that law particularly affect those generals as they made decisions? I'd have to say not very much, but that's not because no one was aware of it or interested. Hap Arnold convened a committee in 1943 to advise him on strategic bombing. It included one civilian lawyer. That lawyer said, area bombing is illegal and immoral. Besides that, it's ineffective. It's likely to not be effective. We should not do it. Arnold ignored that somewhat gently. Arnold said that the bomber was the most humane of all weapons because it would end the war faster, and that's what he thought was most important. LeMay typically was more blunt. LeMay said, all war is immoral, and if you let that bother you, you're not a good soldier. Recognize that LeMay's perspective had much support in the American public. The public response to the firebombing of Tokyo was jubilation. The headlines in the newspapers screamed revenge. the sense of making up for what had happened at Pearl Harbor and of an ability to strike at an otherwise seemingly remote enemy was of great solace to the American people engaged in a great war. So I don't think it's right to put LeMay's perspective outside of the mainstream American perspective as that was embraced by many at the time. So does LeMay stand, if not outside World War II, does he stand as an exemplar of World War II, which is itself outside of the history of bombing and deserves a special place? Is World War II an aberration? After all, LeMay's stance on the immorality of war is certainly not the professional military stance. No officer would stand up to that and say all war is immoral. So does LeMay belong out of the picture, and is it really a red herring to discuss him? I'd say no. And so let's talk about this last section of my talk today, and that's about the ineffectiveness of bombing and what happened after the war. After World War II, the U.S. Air Force makes strategic bombing its raison d'etre. It becomes the primary tool by which the Air Force gains funding and prestige and status in a very competitive rivalry among the services after the war, despite what one historian of bombing and of air power has called the poorly understood relationship between bombing and enemy capitulation. The Air Force didn't really study that very effectively, but it did stress that strategic bombing would be the way to win future wars, cheaply and quickly with minimal loss of U.S. lives. So the first question to answering this is, did strategic bombing work during World War II? The jury is out. It certainly had an impact. For instance, the combined bomber offensive against Germany, the British and American raids against Germany, destroyed the Luftwaffe. The German Air Force could not control its airspace, and because it was worn out from trying to bring down this relentless onslaught of bombers in part, and also because those bombers were effective in doing things like taking out oil, which was a target the Americans argued for all the time that the British weren't as interested in pursuing. So there wasn't fuel for the planes that were there. That relentless bombing had an impact, there's no doubt. But did it have the impact that its advocates prescribed that it was having and advocated and asserted it was? I think not. In fact, the bombing seemed not to demoralize the German population, but to harden resolve and anger and resentment at the bombers that were a faceless enemy that, with great terror and fright, came through and killed innocents effectively. It's also one Army historian has argued in an interesting and convincing fashion, I think, that it's not at all clear that in a war-torn population that a demoralized set of civilians has any more ability to sway its government than a gung-ho and excited set of civilians who are actually supportive of the war effort. So civilian morale, while it's accepted as a reasonable goal and objective of military firepower during the war, it's not clear that that's actually a relevant military target that has results. I could give you more detail about what happened to Japan too, but I think it's similarly mixed, that the strategic bombing did not have the effect of forcing capitulation to the extent that its advocates said. Okay, what about other wars? If we can say it's mixed in terms of its impact during World War II, what about other wars? Did we abandon this after the war? Well, the answer is no. The Air Force certainly didn't abandon this strategy. The Korean War, the first chance for the Air Force to fight another war and use strategic bombing, Air Force generals were aggressive in arguing for firebombing of Korean cities. After initial resistance from political leaders, that did happen with little restraint. The first of those raids took place in January of 1951. It burned out 35% of the city of Pyongyang. After that, dams were struck, reminiscent of the famous dam buster raid of 1943, where RAF flyers took out a German dam, causing great damage to farms, for instance, and killing a couple of thousand people, including mostly prisoners of war, actually, who were in a camp there that was near the dam that was flooded. So the Korean War saw much bombing, but little evidence that forced capitulation. The Vietnam War, I think much the same. Lots of bombing, but little evidence that it forced capitulation. The Air Force leaders at the time argued that the reason was political resistance. That is, they weren't able to bomb the targets they wanted at the time that they wanted, and therefore, even though those targets were eventually bombed, it was not fast enough and at the pace at which they thought was most important. this argument it's hard to completely refute, but it is belied by the total amount of ordnance and the extensive bombing that took place at the time that Air Force leaders wanted later in the war. To give you a sense of the extent of the bombing in Vietnam, initially there was a pretty much aggressive bombing of most of South Vietnam, but very careful bombing in the north. By the end of the war, the United States Air Force had dropped some 6.1 million tons of bombs in Vietnam, vastly more than had been dropped by all of the Allied powers in all of World War II. And yet that didn't bring capitulation. So there's not really evidence from either the Korean War or the Vietnam War that strategic bombing as a strategy, as a military operation, was decisive in bringing about the end of the war or bringing it about faster in the way that Arnold and LeMay thought that it would. Let me just mention briefly, there is a distinction that some military theorists make between counter-force strikes and counter-value coercion. And I think that that distinction helps us understand the different parts of strategic bombing in some ways. That is, counter-force is a strike against a military force. It's direct. That's not illegal under the laws of war. That's a legitimate military target, a military supply depot, a military force in the field, an aircraft staging area, an airstrip. On the other hand, counter-value coercion, that points to this illegitimate goal, illegitimate set of targets of strategic bombing, and that is the civilian morale target, trying to change people's minds by killing the women and children and elderly persons who are not actually fighting at the time. That sort of counter-value coercion, no one says that that should be a goal in and of itself. The question now is really to what extent do we accept that as a consequence of trying to target military installations and military forces specifically. Okay. The bombing continues to have tremendous appeal. I want to wrap up with a few comments about bombing in general and then a set of broader speculations about where this leaves us today. Why does bombing continue to have such tremendous appeal? Well, I'd say that romance is not entirely gone from our sense of what air power is and where the Air Force stands in relation to fighting wars. I also think that the cheapness of air power and the distance that it imposes between the killed and the killers is an important element of this. One writer has written about this as the relationship between guilt and altitude, and that it's actually easier for persons to engage in this sort of, to fight modern wars if they're not close to the tip of the spear. To answer Clark's question, to answer the questions I had about Clark, which is, did the forefathers of strategic bombing, did they doubt what they were doing was moral? Absolutely they did. Absolutely they did. Even General LeMay did to some extent. In his memoirs, he briefly, he's not one to dwell on his doubts, but he certainly mentioned that he was concerned about this. But in his mind, the calculus weighed in favor of pursuing a more aggressive campaign. But all of those leaders did doubt the wisdom, the legality, and the effectiveness of bombing, but they chose to use it anyway. They knew it was likely illegal. They were sure that it was immoral, and they, in a different context, that is, but they felt it was okay in this context, and they thought it was probably ineffective. Many of the public shared that view, and I think that that's an important part of what I'd like to communicate. I think that it's a mistake for the public to not reckon with the real consequences of war. That's true now, and that was true during World War II. I think that it's still easier to see war as cleaner and more sterile and more distant in the way that air war lets us see that. But that seeming cleanliness is belied by looking at the impact of the bombing itself. It doesn't, when we understand what actually happens when those bombs hit the ground, I think we can't preserve that sense of a cleaner type of war. To give you one example of that, Mike Davis, who's a wide-ranging historian, he recently wrote a history of the car bomb. He titled its second chapter, The Poor Man's Air Force. That's a suggestion of the way in which the car bomb is much like the Air Force. Stealthy, powerful, destructive, efficient, cheap in terms of lives lost, simple, and often indiscriminate. Strategic bombing, then, as the centerpiece of the Air Force's contribution to military action, then, is much like the car bomb of American military strategy. Now, the principle that the indiscriminate part of this breaks that principle of distinction, That's a principle that remains hard to draw today. It's been hard in the past. It's hard today in different ways. Military contractor versus soldier, civilian versus soldier, insurgent versus civilian, terror versus strategy. But recognize that that contest, the blurriness of that line, has long been here for us. It's not a new concept in war. It's also not new to target non-combatants. There's a book that a historian wrote, John Grenner, who's an Air Force historian. He wrote a book called The First Way of War, published a couple years ago. The subtitle is American War Making on the Frontier. He argues that violence against non-combatants is a part of the way war has been waged for a long time by American forces. This is what he says, quote, "Violence directed systematically against non-combatants through irregular means from the start has been a central part of Americans' way of war." He also argues it was effective, that it was a result of many things, not only military strategies, but social goals, economic needs, as well as military necessity. In some ways, although we like to hide behind the pace of technological change and think that the pace of technology is changing the nature of warfare so much that the rules from the past no longer hold, I don't think that that's a fair reading of history. I don't think wars of the future will necessarily be so different from the past. I don't think the pace of technological change is really so different right now than what it has been in the past. Stephen Biddle, who's an important scholar and actually policy analyst right now for the armed forces, he's written that militaries have been forced to cope with steadily increasing lethality, range, surveillance capabilities for fully a century now. These are hardly sudden developments that are posing fundamentally new problems to the armed forces. In other words, the problems that we have in fighting war, drawing lines, making distinctions, judging proportionality, they stay constant, whether our means is strategic bombing or whether it's some alternative tactic. Alfred Nobel thought dynamite would render armed conflict too costly and thus end war. Many more thought the same thing about the machine gun. Air power theorists thought that about the airplane. And then, of course, there's the atomic bomb. But none of those have ended war. Strategic bombing certainly has not. I think that strategic bombing is part of the vocabulary of war that David Kennedy has told us, this convergence of military and humanitarian law, a vocabulary of just war, legitimate targeting, proportionate violence, and prohibited weaponry. Part of that is strategic bombing in all its appeal, its horrors, and its failures. Thank you. I'd be happy to take some questions. Yeah.
Yes, actually, please wait till the microphone gets to you because we're webcasting, and that's the only way it'll get picked up.
Thanks. Thank you for that excellent presentation. I have a question about the changing technology of smart weapons and laser-guided bombs. If one side has them and the other side doesn't, does proportionality now require the side that has the high technology to use the most expensive weapons at their disposal if they are more discriminating?
Yes, I think that it does. That if there is potential, I mean, proportionality doesn't go to the amount of damage caused as to the relationship between the damage caused and the goal. But so your question is not right to proportionality, but to maybe to necessity. So that's right. So if it's more force, in other words, the cheap, indiscriminate bomb is more force than what's required to achieve the objective, then it is necessary to use the more expensive, less forceful means of getting to that objective. Yes. Oh, you need the microphone. Sorry.
Can you speak to the subject of preventive war?
It's illegal.
I've always thought that the beginning of strategic bombing in the modern era was at Guernica during the Spanish Civil War and what the Germans were doing during the Blitz and, of course, with their V-1 and V-2 attacks. I was interested to hear your quotation about Hap Arnold believing that ending the war quickly was the greatest good because that, of course, was General Sherman's point of view during the march through Georgia, just a year after General Lieber's statement. And I just want to make a point before I ask you a question. I certainly concede that casualty estimates about invading Japan have grown over the years, but I think when the Joint Chiefs of Staff made their first estimate, they had not fully recognized the fight to the last ditch approach that Japanese forces were taking at Saipan, at Okinawa, and Iwo Jima and whatnot. And they knew, I think, that the Japanese defending their home islands would really fight quite fiercely. And school children were being armed with bamboo spears, for instance, being instructed to take at least one American life with them before they went. And as I recall, it was not until the news of the second atomic bombing reached the Supreme War Council that Emperor Hirohito intervened for the first time and directed a surrender. And even then, there was an abortive coup by junior Japanese military officers. So as awful as they were, I have to think that both Hiroshima and Nagasaki were militarily necessary. Would you agree?
Okay, let me take the first part first, which is about the relative timing and the birth of strategic bombing. And I think it's good points. Where we start is a critical question that always deserves to be interrogated. And I agree that the military actions that Guernica and then the Blitz, those are definitely in the realm of qualifying as targeting civilians specifically. My comments at the end were intended to suggest that I don't think that Arnold or LeMay were the authors of a brand new strategy. That's certainly much before that, much before even what you mentioned. There was purposeful targeting of civilians with the hopes of ending wars faster, or with the hopes of revenge. I mean, we don't have to give them all salutary motives. We can also recognize some vindictiveness in military leaders as well as in the rest of us. So I think those are fair points. And I was speaking really to the American side of this, to the American air power piece. But it's certainly a response to what else is happening out there. So good points. The other piece, I'm not ready to say they were militarily necessary, the atomic bomb strikes. But I agree that it is a much more complex terrain than I sketched out in these brief remarks. The only thing I would add to what you had to say is that I think that the bigger political picture is complicated by the unconditional surrender debate and the need for the emperor to go, for instance, and how that was communicated and the valence of that in Japanese culture. And I think on both sides, it's possible to see many different concessions that would have led to a faster end of the war that didn't make the dropping of the bombs, especially the second bomb. But it's debated in the literature. So I agree that it's more complicated, but I'm not ready to say I see them as necessary.
I want to make a contribution to that last exchange and then pose my question. And the contribution is that next Tuesday, the Department of History here is hosting Mike Neufeld, who is the curator for space aviation at the Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian. And he's going to be giving a talk about Wernher von Braun and the Cold War and space aviation. But most importantly, Mike is the author of the censored script of the Enola Gay exhibit, which was suppressed in 1995-96. So Mike would have some very interesting interventions on this if you turn out next Tuesday, March 25th, 4:30 in Mandel Center, room 115. My question to you is, from my context as a historian of Germany, observing the fact that the first half of this decade, Germany really fixated on coming to grips with the idea of Germans as victims, and as victims largely of the strategic bombing campaign. You had multiple valences from the effort to rebuild the Frauenkirche in Dresden, which was reconsecrated in 2006. You had Günter Grass's novel Crab Walk, and most notably, you had the powerful emotive response of Jörg Friedrich's book, The Fire, which was about not only Dresden, but about Hamburg, the original accidental firestorm, which triggered in the mind of Bomber Harris and others the idea that this could potentially be done intentionally. How do you make of this relatively neutral arm's length kind of debate distant in time? Clearly there's a generational element to why this happened in Germany this decade and not earlier, of coming to grips with victimhood in the context of one's own morally questionable or morally reprehensible, clearly morally reprehensible military goals. And I should point out that two things. The German bombing of Warsaw and Rotterdam, more than Guernica, and certainly before the Blitz, were what really fixed in people's mind the new technological capacity of air warfare. But secondly, I think it's a slippery slope to compare ourselves to a bunch of Nazi generals as the question of what the moral level on which we should conduct war would be. That was more of a comment. I'm interested in your comment about the coming to grips with the past.
I find the question fascinating. I'm not sure quite how to attack it. But I wonder if it strategically, tactically, narrowly, broadly, area, carpet, maybe it's a stages of reckoning. I think that the historiography of war is a process of gradually coming to grips, not only with altering figures, with expedient goals in mind, but also with real data altering the way that we understand it, and then understanding the decisions that were made in relative haste or with great preparation that comes before. In other words, Michael Sherry argues that the atomic bomb is but an incremental step, that the firebombing of Tokyo, for instance, makes it clear that there's really nothing that stands between obliteration of cities and civilians and what was already happening. It's really just a minor step. On the other hand, you can still see atomic weaponry and the use of nuclear weapons as a massive as a paradigm-shifting event in military history as well as world history. So I think the reckoning, the cultural reckoning that you're talking about that goes along with integrating wars into one's past, it continues. I mean, my context is American-centric, so I think about the Vietnam War and the many iterations that it's gone through as we reckon with it. And I remember teaching that to students at the Air Force Academy, and they resisted so much, they struggled so much with the idea that the Air Force had not been constrained, which is the standard historiographical take right now, that the restraint of the Air Force was not the reason that the Air Force didn't win. But they found that hard to accept as this institution that they were ascending into and that they held in such high regard and that they didn't want to believe could have failed in such a context. And I don't know what that light that sheds on what you're talking about in terms of cultural reconciliation, but it seems a piece of the stages of dealing with the past and especially with Germany, the victimhood and the power dynamics. Yes. Over here, we have the mic. We'll do this row next, sir.
Okay. You mentioned about Wesley Clark, that he said that the bombings of Japan, which took place in World War II, would not be legal today. But I'm wondering what Wesley Clark would think about his own bombing campaigns against Serbia. I mean, it seemed like the bombing campaigns included bridges, TV stations, and the Chinese embassy. I mean, does this not violate the distinction?
Yes, I think that it does. I think that Clark would see it as such, but would see it as part of the necessity and also an inadvertent. I mean, I know how he would reconcile those would be that it wasn't the intent of the attack. But no, the subsequent, the post-Vietnam bombing, which I haven't talked about, it has not been so precise that we can separate it from an indiscriminate bombing that I talk about in earlier wars. That's absolutely right. Can you send that mic down there? Thank you.
Okay, I want to begin with a comment about Iraq and General Petraeus. Many times when he's been interviewed, he will say, I'm in the military, we only carry out policy, we don't make policy. And yet all of your talk about bombing, you keep referring to generals. Are you telling us that those generals made policy, or wasn't our government ever involved in deciding about what's to be done?
A great question and fair. The government was involved. FDR and Churchill were important leaders in pushing this. However, I think it's hard to underestimate the extent to which generals like LeMay controlled what was happening. The first time that he undertook a raid against a German city, he did it without authorization. When he undertook the firebombing of Tokyo, his commander had recently been replaced, but he had the acquiescence of his commanding officer. And I don't believe that FDR knew exactly what was happening with the firebombing of Tokyo. An example from after the war, when LeMay built the Strategic Air Command had complete control of nuclear weapons in the United States. During the Korean War, when there was, and actually even later than that, when there were nuclear options raised, only LeMay knew the PSYOP, the Integrated Operations Plan, the plan for the deployment of nuclear weapons. He had not released that to the President or to the JCS because he didn't trust them. So I think it's possible for generals to have the kind of control that LeMay had. I don't think it's healthy, and I don't think it's the case today.
Recently, especially following the shooting down of the spy satellites by the U.S., there's been talk about war in space. Do you feel that the romance extends as we're going into a bit further into the air combat?
The weaponization of space is well underway and having been a space operations officer, I don't think space is quite as sexy as air. We did wear flight suits though when I was working in Cheyenne Mountain in an effort to try to appear cooler. But
it's hard to be cool with
true enough. I just had to stay on and think about that for a second. But I do think that the space wars that are it's not the connection to the ground is there are in the course of checking what the most recent sort of military training is on the laws of war, there's quite a bit about space. Space-based lasers are illegal, for instance. Any sort of laser that's specifically intended to blind is illegal. I mean, there are quite a lot of rules that contemplate this, but the official line still, and the U.S. is very careful tiptoeing around the knockdown of that satellite there, is that anti-satellite weapons are not supposed to be in the U.S. arsenal. So, yeah, I don't think that that's the case, but down here.
Going back to your earlier historical comments, what about the Nuremberg trials? Was any law established or was law quoted as a result of the firebombing of Rotterdam, my native city, or Coventry, or any of those other happenings? You did not mention that.
Right. Nuremberg did not bring justice to bear on the authors of those war crimes. That's right. It is. It is. Let's take one more question from over here, and then or do we have to end, or should I keep everybody set? Okay, one more question over here.
I just could ask you about what's different about the firebombing. I have this vague recollection it just sucks out all the air. How does it work that's different than the regular bombing of London and Coventry?
Right. It's called a thermobaric reaction. That they're fuel air explosives, and as you mentioned that Hamburg was the mistake. Like by accident, they realized that they actually could create a firestorm. So there's enough fire that's created in a close-in region, and somebody can correct me if I'm describing this incorrectly, that it does pull in the air. It creates gale force winds that then bring more air into the fire, because one of the limiting factors for a quick burning fire is the lack of oxygen, so that it will burn itself out very quickly. But because of the winds that were created by the intensity of the heat that was generated by the incendiaries, it pulled in air and then kept other things burning as a result, so it didn't stop.
But its consumption of oxygen is so fast that it asphyxiates people insulated from the thermal aspect by eliminating all the oxygen.
As did napalm. We're going to have to end here, but there is a reception outside, which I invite you all. And I invite you to join me in thanking Professor Hillman. And on those foggy, cold mornings in San Francisco, I hope you'll wear the Global Security Institute fleece proudly. Hey,